Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
Oh, we're talking about all kinds of good stuff during the break as we ramp up here for the Morgan Streetman Show. But boy, do we have a lot to get into. First of all, Morgan, did you have a good 4th of July?
I certainly did. I had a very good 4th of July. Enjoyed celebrating it up in Birmingham, Alabama, of all places.
Good for you.
On purpose?
Yeah, heck yeah. The Magic City, baby. It's a beautiful town.
Right, that's what I hear.
A lot of old buildings that they've maintained, especially downtown.
It's just hard to get there by, you land somewhere, you pretty much have to drive.
Yeah, except unless you take Southwest, because Southwest has a direct out of Tampa.
Oh, do they? Okay.
They do. And that's the way to go. Although, in truth, Southwest is, not always the way to go, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But
I like their staff. They have friendly staff. And
they do.
They try to make it fun.
They do. They make it fun. And I generally like that they're on time and things like that. The thing that I don't like about Southwest is they have apparently more passengers per capita who feel it is appropriate to wear a tank top onto the airplane than any other airline, as far as I'm concerned. And I don't know. That just sticks in old Morgan's craw.
The best airline, they were just awarded this, is Delta. Delta's been awarded from whatever publication the best airline in the world, and they're making things even better because they're about to add to their international flights towel service for the main cabin, free drinks for the main cabin, and bistro dining. So it's almost like a throwback kind of thing.
Bistro dining.
Now it's like, here are your peanuts.
Right.
Have a nice day.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how those bistro sandwiches are really going to taste, Fresh out of the freezer. Well,
it's all in the marketing.
Delta actually started out, did you know this, as a crop dusting company?
I had no idea.
Yeah, that's what the name Delta is, because they were in the Mississippi Delta as a crop dusting company.
Okay.
Yeah, that was their original
flight pattern.
Yeah, exactly. And now they've morphed into a passenger airline, and probably one of the largest, if not the largest in the world.
Yep. Worked out well for them.
It surely did. Well, I tell you, it's rainy day out there, and I understand we may even have our first tropical depression coming up, which is a storm system that's coming down out of the south, out of North Georgia and North Alabama, and is supposed to hit the Gulf, and then maybe potentially become the first tropical depression of the hurricane season this year. They say that's going to happen possibly sometime this week, and they put it at something like an 80% chance that actually turns into a tropical depression. Wow. So while it kind of seems like we might have a tropical depression out there right now, the way this rain is just sitting on us, that hasn't happened yet, but we might be able to expect one within the week.
So, it's that time of year.
It is. And, I tell you what, I have to say, it beats tornadoes. It really beats tornadoes, because at least we get a couple days warning.
And it beats earthquakes.
And we're going to tell you about some earthquakes and some other things, some volcanoes. We'll get into some of that later. It'll be pretty exciting stuff, or potentially pretty scary stuff. But if you want to get on the line with us, the number to call is 888-404-1010. And before we get into some of our stories for the day, wanted to tell folks we're getting ready to move to a new time slot in the evenings for our Monday evening replay. It's going to be moving, instead of 5 p.m., is going to move soon, and I don't know exactly when that's going to happen. It's going to move
super soon. Today. Could be
as soon as today, as far as I know. Is going to move to 6 p.m., so we'll be on from 6 to 7 p.m., so kind of a late evening drive time for you. But, and of course, now we've moved to 10 a.m., our live show, which obviously you're listening to right now, live at 10 a.m. From noon, so changes are afoot, and we're hoping that they're going to be great changes and give us the opportunity to be listened to by some folks who didn't already know about us. So, all right, well, we wanted to take a quick look back this week at a story that we got into last week, and was actually our Out There last week, which was all about Bernie Sanders taking his honeymoon in Moscow in the Soviet Union in 1988. And part of that was, he was sitting around this table drinking vodka with the KGB agents and these other useful idiots from the Burlington Town Council that went with them. They went over as VIP intellectual guests, and we shared with you an interview with a KGB defector, and that interview actually occurred 4 years before Bernie Sanders even went over to Soviet Union. But that defector explained the whole process that they went through to keep their alleged VIP intellectual guests liquored up the whole time and then use them for propaganda purposes. And boy, if you look at that video with Bernie Sanders with no shirt on, did you get a chance to go watch that?
Pat and I looked at it.
I mean, come on. Is that not disqualifying?
We do our homework.
Yeah.
Morgan, you tell us what to watch on what to go Google, and we do it.
Isn't that fascinating?
It's very fascinating.
It's absolutely disqualifying as far as I'm concerned. The man should not be in public office. But one of the things they did in the video is they sang that, or part of that terrible song, that Woody Guthrie song, This Land Is Your Land, and old Morgan spouted off, hey, that's a communist song. Well, I thought I should expound on that a little bit because I didn't get to explain what I meant. I mean, number one, Woody Guthrie's kind of a well-known communist from those days, and you're talking about back in the 1930s and 40s when there was a major communist infestation of our country and of our government. And folks, if you've heard, I'm sure you've heard about McCarthy, and you've always heard, Red Scare, red baiting, he was terrible, blacklisting people. And the thing is, Joseph McCarthy was right. He was correct about the communist invasion of our government. Now, he's been blacklisted by history, and that's actually the name of a book that if you're interested in educating yourself about this, you should go out there and get and read. And it's by Stanton Evans called Blacklisted by History. And it basically goes through the fact that Joe McCarthy was actually 100% right about what he was railing against, the communist attempted takeover of our government. Another book you could read if you're interested in that time period is Whittaker Chambers' book, Witness, which is just an amazing book. Whittaker Chambers was one of the high-level communist agents operating in Washington, D.C., and was part of a spying ring that included a whole bunch of people, including State Department officials and others. And there were very famous trials about this stuff way back then as well. But unfortunately, a lot of this history has been forgotten, and we don't talk about it. And, of course, we've got our, Google, our nanny, Google, who kind of keeps track of what we're allowed to see and not allowed to see. And I'll tell you what, if you look up... They
came out with more of that this week, too.
Yeah.
They're doing it with all your Gmails, what you buy. They track all of that, even if you delete it.
Right. They track it, and they also... they keep you from getting to a certain amount of information. So, for example, if you're to type in lyrics, This Land Is Your Land, just directly into Google, you will not find this original verse that I'm about to tell you about. Okay? But this original verse clearly identifies this as a communist sympathizer song. Okay? The song was written in 1940, but it wasn't released until 51. And the verse that was originally written in it says, there was a big high wall there that tried to stop me. The sign was painted, said private property. But on the back side, it didn't say nothing. This sign was made for you and me. And that was in the original lyrics of Woody Guthrie's song. And if you don't believe me, Pat George, run him singing it, if you've got it.
This land was made for you and me. There was a big high wall there that tried to stop me. The sign was painted, said private property, but on the back side it didn't say nothing. This land was made for you and me.
So there you go. That's Woody Guthrie himself singing his original version, and we just pulled that one verse out of there because, folks, I think they might say, oh, you're making that up or something. No, we're not making that up. That was in the song originally. That's what the song's about. It's anti-private property, and he was a communist sympathizer or an actual communist. Back then, they'd call them fellow travelers if you were just a communist sympathizer. So I know he's been referred to as a fellow traveler, but likely he was also an actual Communist Party member. So in any event, we wanted to just share that with you just so you know that I'm not just making stuff up. I'm not just slinging around slanderous statements about people. If I say that's a communist song, that Morgan Streetman's got a reason for saying that. And it's worth, if you don't right off the bat agree with me, it's worth looking into it a little bit to try and figure out where I was coming from, because I'm not just trying to throw around a bunch of, name calling and stuff that doesn't apply. But I thought it was important to let you know what the actual basis of that song was that they were singing there in Moscow, Russia in 1988. Well, we got a local interest story, and Pat George, local interest story for you. And I know, Pat George, this is one that you're kind of involved in because didn't I hear you went out to the beach recently?
He observed it.
I saw some people enjoying the beach, but not enjoying the water.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was probably wise.
Tell us about this, Roxanne.
Well, we just have a new case. A woman from Orlando was over at Turtle Beach Monday, which Turtle Beach is down by Sarasota.
Sarah, I've been there.
And so she was there celebrating her birthday. She went swimming. She had a nick from shaving, which how many women shave before you go to the beach. That's exactly what you do. It's easy to cut yourself. And a day later, her ankle was swollen. The cut was really, really red. And sure enough, she could barely put pressure on it. Sure enough, she heard about the flesh-eating bacteria, and she had it.
Oh, my goodness.
So very scary. So they've been giving her all kinds of antibiotics and treating her. But they say right now, don't go in the water if you have any sort of cut on you. And who doesn't have, a little nick or, as if you walk on the beach, you step on some shells, all kinds of things can happen.
Well, and mostly you might not even know about it. If you get a bug bite or something, you're kind of scratching it heavy duty, you might not even know if you broke the skin. And then you go to the beach, and the next thing you know, you got flesh-eating bacteria. I mean, it's like a nightmare scenario. Mm-hmm. Well, apparently that's in our water because of the heat right now, so maybe stay out of the water for right now. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. We're getting into a discussion about social media censorship. I think, Morgan, you and I have both experienced it to some degree. Yeah,
well, I mean, I know I have because, I post, I've got about 1,000 followers on Twitter, and any of my posts are rarely viewed by more than 50 people. So I don't think Twitter is pushing my posts out to my followers. So when they go onto their Twitter account and they go scrolling through, they just don't ever see the posts. Because if they were to see them, it would go towards my impressions count, which, like I said, is always about 50. So that means about 50 people saw my post go across their screen at some point. It doesn't mean they really looked at it. It just means it went across their screen at some point. So, from my perspective, and I talked to some people about this, it's almost like, well, why bother? Why bother taking any time to go to Twitter as a platform and post my content on there if it's not going to be seen by anybody? It's kind of a waste of time. And maybe that's part of Twitter's strategy. And I certainly think it could be part of the strategy here kind of on the lower end, that is people with not having millions of followers, but just normal people like me who might have 1,000, maybe 5,000 followers. They could just kind of click your account, and I don't know what button they're clicking, but, maybe suspicious account or something. They click that button, and all of a sudden you're just not being published out to your followers, and so nobody's seeing your content.
What's interesting with Facebook, I'm very apolitical. I don't post anything political on Facebook ever. It's family stuff, whatever. And then on Twitter, I will like a tweet here, a controversial tweet. Hey, George Papadopoulos, I like what he has to say. I like what Morgan Streetman has to say. And I lose followers on Twitter, I swear. Maybe it's my imagination, but I've kind of connected the dots. If I like something that seems to be a bit controversial, contrary to how they would see things,
absolutely,
it seems like I lose followers.
Right. And you don't even know if that's your followers saying, oh, I don't want to see anything political. Right. Or it could just be Twitter. I mean, apparently
that's what I'm saying, even if I just like something.
They take people away. Well, we had one of our longtime listeners have a similar experience, and so he's actually called in today, and it's Gary Allen. Gary, tell us about what happened to you last week.
Okay, on Wednesday, 7/3, and it was approximately 8:30 a.m. as they have it listed. Not sure exactly, but I had a message flagged for violation of their community standards policy, and pretty much simultaneously, there was a crash on Facebook and Messenger and also one other service, which I don't use. So as I tried to post as a test in different places, all I was getting was the rebuffer sign, and I felt I was just being instantly blocked.
Wow.
So it was kind of a simultaneous error that I thought I was being singled out and felt quite proud. But that's basically what happened. I mean, I tweet on the fly. I don't tweet for anybody else but myself. It's a matter of venting, actually.
It's Gary's World.
I know a lot of people see
Twitter,
what I post, but they won't respond.
Yeah.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
I said it's Gary's World on Twitter, so you do what you want to do. It's your Twitter handle.
Exactly.
Well, Gary, to the extent that you can without causing me to be fined by the FCC, tell us a little bit about the tweet that actually got you. What did they do? They basically suspended you for a full week on Twitter?
No, I was suspended and asked for a review, and then they said it's still violated, so I can only see it on my page. I mean, as I look at the message and I look at their community standards, possibly my message of or my mention of illegal migrants and also the country of Ecuador involved, I think that they could possibly use that as a reason to, block me. But seeing the other things that are on Facebook and Twitter, and that was a retweet from Rob Smith on Twitter, by the way, which I retweeted and commented on. I mean, some things I see out there are ridiculous. I believe that's your feeling as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I guess I take it from what you're saying that if they did suspend you under the community standards, which, seem to be interpreted by the individual who's enforcing them as opposed to actually being the rule of law where you could look and see in the community standards what you are and are not allowed to post. It seems to be up to their opinion whether you violated it, but maybe they would say that by use of the word illegal, because we already know that they've said that the word illegal alien is, a racist slander, essentially. And even though that word has a legal definition, that word's been used for, I think hundreds of years in this country. And, as a matter of fact, the people are not here legally. So it is an illegal person they've come here, but the control of the media has been such that by and large, they've all banded together and said, you're not allowed to say that word anymore. Is that the word you think that got you in trouble?
I think so. But when I tweet, once again, I tweet in anger sometimes or just wanting to respond instantly. And when I said illegal migrants, I actually had mentioned in the same sentence the migrants at the border that came from Ecuador, for instance, complaining about their conditions, and we all know the story on that. But I was also thinking of all the illegal migrants that are in our country illegally and committing crimes.
Sure.
But because I phrased it as I did, I think that's why they got me. And really, I could care less because I feel they should be gone. And now that the money's been appropriated to help out at the border, reluctantly by some, I think things are going to improve. And I really don't care. I trust President Trump with everything I have. And I want to make one quick comment that he tweets, and many supporters say, I just wish he would tone it down. And I've heard, I think you guys say the same thing, and I respect that. But when else have I known a president that has told me every day what is in his head and he is thinking, A, and B, I could be tweeting that. I think exactly as he does. And when he tweets out, I'm saying, good man, because that's what we believe. He's redefined what a president is, not the stuffy, staunch president that says this and that at the press briefing. And also, as far as socialism, quickly, look at the countries that are socialist, including countries that are in trouble, Greece, Venezuela. Those countries, their leaders are always living very, very well, and their people are suffering. Mm-hmm. So I really have no respect for them, and socialism, of course, is all out. You have to look at history.
Right.
Two things to respond to your first comment, Gary, about President Trump and when he tweets it, how it makes you feel. It's interesting because I get very frustrated the more stories I read about various censorship on Twitter. For example, James Woods. Okay, he's not allowed to tweet anymore. And I thought a lot of what he said at times made a lot of sense, but he's lost his privileges. Mm-hmm. And so it actually gives me comfort when you see I get scared sometimes. I think, wow, are we not going to have voices anymore? Freedom of speech is going away. So President Trump saying things the way that he does reminds me that, well, at least with him in that position, we don't have utter, violation of freedom of speech. So that makes me feel pretty good.
Right. But even he says he thinks his account has been, somewhat toned down in a sense of it's not being pushed out to all of his followers. He thinks he loses followers. And supposedly they're trying to look into this. And I know Congressman Devin Nunes actually has a suit against the various social media companies for this kind of targeting of conservatives. And, you mentioned James Woods, but we also had Diamond and Silk, I think, got deplatformed from Facebook. You remember? I know you're looking shocked. But the thing is, we forget about these things because, it's just like...
They go away and we don't hear from him anymore. We forget about him, Laura Loomer.
Well, the Gestapo shows up in the night. People get shuttled into a van and driven off and never mentioned again. They're essentially erased from the world. And so we kind of forget about it because we tend to focus on what the media is repeating over and over again that we ought to focus on. But, others, Alex Jones has been seriously deplatformed, I think, across the board on social media. Milo Yiannopoulos also has been deplatformed pretty much across the board, and Paul Joseph Watson. Now, none of these people do I agree with everything they say, or maybe even in the case of Milo Yiannopoulos, I might not agree with a bunch of what he says. But I support people's right to speak their mind. That's one of the core concepts in our government and in our country is the idea that we are supposed to protect freedom of speech, even speech that we don't like and speech that we don't agree with. And that seems to have fallen by the wayside, and particularly in the way that people are interacting with each other. And Gary, an interesting thing is that, the stuff that you posted is mild. It's mild compared to what we've seen posted by some of the Antifa accounts or some of the stuff we've seen posted by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the kind of things that she's said about, for instance, Customs and Border Patrol. And the things that they're allegedly doing to migrant girls, which are totally fabricated. She just made that up and slandered them with it. But she doesn't get deplatformed. Then you retweet somebody else and make your own personal comment, and they hammer you for violating the community standards.
Exactly. And James Woods was fantastic. I love the man. I agreed with everything he said, as far as I can tell. And Diamond and Silk, their humor and truth is definitely needed during this time, especially with many African Americans jumping aboard and realizing that it's the Democratic Party that's destroyed them, not the Republican Party. And I'm not a lifelong Republican because when I was younger, I was ignorant. But now that I've been studying up, boy, I should have never been a Democrat in my entire life.
I'll leave us on a high note with Twitter. So I was reading one of Michael Moore's tweets recently, and he said, we'll give you universal health care, free college, and a secure paper ballot to vote on. Come to our side. And I looked at all the comments beneath it, and they were all ripping him like, Michael, thank you. I like to work for my health care. I like to work for, I don't want handouts. And I was like, well, that's good. At least Twitter isn't, hiding those comments. It seems like people have their voice in that regard.
Right. Well, but they're definitely doing something, and it's something that they shouldn't be doing. So, Gary, thank you for calling in, sharing your personal story with us. It's a story shared by many of us, and it's something we've really got to get on top of in this country, and that's freedom of speech. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show.
Yes, and something big happened this weekend in California. I should say Friday.
Yeah, could you believe that? I mean, here we go, potentially. Is this the big one, or is this a signal that the big one may be coming? And so there was a 7.1 magnitude earthquake in Los Angeles last week, and apparently thousands of aftershocks. They've already counted, a couple thousand, maybe even more by now, since I last looked at the update. And just imagine that number of aftershocks. It's just like constant shaking, I would imagine.
Right.
Now, the aftershocks are much less powerful than the initial earthquake, but, they still signal that there's still energy being released along the fault lines. And apparently this was a kind of a shearing force earthquake where the fault line sheared along itself. But, we have been wondering and waiting now for many years, in my mind. We've been waiting for the big one. Remember when we were younger that they were talking about how California might literally detach from the United States by a massive earthquake on the San Andreas Fault and other fault lines, because California's got quite a few throughout the state, but that we might actually see the state detach. Well, we never saw that happen, but we're still waiting for that big one that could, and it's a scary thought, but could destroy the entirety of Los Angeles. So that, is predicted. It's going to happen someday. It's overdue for what they think for the predictions. And what they've actually done is they've said, well, we can't tell you exactly when it's going to happen, but they're predicting that there will be a major follow-on earthquake in the next 2 weeks. They've predicted it for this week, but I'm going to say outside – we're going to go with a 2-week prediction model and say that within the next 2 weeks, they're predicting another major. The next one may be even larger than 7.1, which is pretty rare to see a 7 or above. So major things going on in California with respect to earthquakes. And speaking of earthquakes, something's finally come to happen with Deutsche Bank. I don't know if you've seen this morning, but Deutsche Bank is functionally insolvent at this point. They're, what they say is in the red is how they're putting it, but that means that they've got more debts than they've got assets, right? So they're functionally insolvent. They plan to cut 18,000 jobs. That's a lot of jobs.
It is.
I mean, there's not many businesses in the world that employ 18,000 people, and certainly not many that would have the ability to fire 18,000 people. And so that's what's happening at Deutsche Bank.
And where are those 18,000 located?
I think it's worldwide.
Worldwide.
Yeah,
okay.
I think it's worldwide. Well, Deutsche Bank has, locations and branches throughout the world. It's Germany's largest bank, and, the interrelated nature of our financial system means that it's got a lot of different contracts and other relations with other banks and other interests throughout the whole world. Rarely when you've got a major loan or something, rarely is that ever done by one bank. A lot of times they put together a consortium of banks that'll come together and make that loan. So Deutsche Bank's probably in on a lot of stuff. I mean, what we're looking at here, and it's just starting because the shoes haven't dropped yet. We're just now getting the news released, and people are running for the doors. People who've got Deutsche Bank accounts probably smartly are going to, move or withdraw some of that money because they're concerned about the overall financial health of the entity, which obviously is in major trouble. So you know what happens then? It starts to build on itself, and it goes exponential as people start to take their money out or request that their money come out of the bank. And those of you that listen to this show a lot know the banks don't have the money. They don't have. When you deposit money with the bank, they're not putting it in the safe. They're taking it and they're loaning it out to somebody. And not only are they loaning that out, they're loaning 10 times the amount that you've deposited. Okay, that's called fractional reserve banking. So, to say that banks are, in essence, a Ponzi scheme, wouldn't be that far off track, to be frank. All right, if you really look at what banking is. So these banks are at high risk. If everybody gets the sense that they want to get out of the bank and take their money out of the banks don't have the money to give all the depositors their money back. And that's how banks can fail. So we don't know what's going to happen with Deutsche Bank. I think you watch Germany step in and try to stabilize things in the same way that the U.S. stepped in and did major stabilization during the Lehman Brothers and the Bear Stearns problems that we faced about a decade ago. But this type of collapse could be a contagion that infects the entire worldwide financial system because of the interconnectedness of all the banks. So are we seeing the beginning of a major downturn in the world financial system and major insolvencies throughout the world? I don't know, but it's certainly possible, and it's definitely something you want to keep your eye on.
Is that going to make things like Bitcoin and everything like that more attractive?
Possibly. I personally, we've had a lot of discussions about Bitcoin, and I wasn't ever able to pull the trigger and buy any because, again, you're just getting an entry in a distributed transaction register. But as people begin to look for places to store their assets, to store their wealth and value outside of the existing financial system, they're moving to things like Bitcoin. And that's why you saw a couple of weeks ago it even popped back up above $10,000. Now, I think it's come back down a little bit, but obviously there's still a lot of interest in Bitcoin, and there are still people who are willing to pay tens of thousands of dollars for a Bitcoin, which if you go back one decade, you could buy them for $1 or less. Okay, you understand that? $1 or less. So it's gone up 10,000 times maybe in the last decade. Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable growth in the alleged value of Bitcoin. And some people might even say that's part of the greater fool theory, which we don't really have time to get into here, but it's that price will go up as long as there's a greater fool to buy the item for more than it's worth than you. And at some point, you run out of fools.
Silent auction.
Right. You don't want to be the last fool, right, bidding at the silent auction. So, but anyway, I'm sure there's much more to the Deutsche Bank story to be written and much more that we're going to be able to tell you over the coming weeks as more news comes out. Speaking of news coming out, though, now this is a story that we have actually covered before on this show, and that is the Jeffrey Epstein story. And, his is a story of abusing young women, minors, children, for decades and getting away with it.
Not so well-kept secret.
Yeah. He's a Palm Beach and New York-based financier. He's a billionaire.
And he was a billionaire before there were more billionaires. So he was a billionaire before it was popular to be a billionaire.
He was before there were so many billionaires that we've seen so many billionaires minted in just the last couple of decades. But no, he was a billionaire in like the late 90s. So he was a billionaire when, that really meant something. And he flies all around the world on his private jet, and there's all kinds of issues with the jet and what goes on the jet. And this is kind of a factually dense story. But, he was investigated by the FBI and even the state's attorney and local law enforcement, but with an FBI component, well over a decade ago because of all the allegations that have been well known. For 20 years, it's been known what this guy does, that he recruits and abuses girls, some as young as 14 and maybe even younger. We don't know all the details of his abuse, but obviously he has no compunctions about abusing minors, female minors. He actually pleaded guilty to 2 counts of soliciting a prostitute, a minor prostitute, back in 2008 and was convicted. Now, he was given 13 months in prison, and this was such a sweetheart deal, and we've talked about this before. He got a sweetheart deal from the U.S. attorney, who's now the secretary of the Department of Labor, who himself I know personally and is actually, I think, a pretty nice guy, Alexander Acosta. So I don't know how he got into this situation where he felt like he needed to give Jeffrey Epstein this sweetheart deal, but I'm sure he regrets it now that they did this. But, I mean, it was a seriously sweetheart deal because they had over 60 victims that they knew about at the time. And remember, Bob Mueller was the director of the FBI at this time, the Boy Scout. The Boy Scout apparently didn't care if Jeffrey Epstein was abusing Girl Scouts. He did not care because they allowed them to enter into a non-prosecution agreement that was secret. And we've reported on that.
And was there, maybe I'm mixing stories together, but was there some other tie between Epstein and Mueller where he had him testify or as a witness in another case?
Yeah.
Separate from this case.
Exactly. That's what's been alleged.
That's really muddied the waters.
You nailed it. That was thrown out there as an allegation, apparently to muddy the waters, because the story was that the FBI let him go in exchange for him giving information and testimony against the Bear Stearns people.
That's right.
About their bad acts during the collapse. But I will tell you, just recently, like within the past month or so, Fox Business has reported, and there are multiple sources. These are not anonymous sources. These are folks who have allowed for themselves to be named in the story, who say that he did not provide any information for that prosecution. So that was a red herring that was thrown out there to muddy the water. Like, well, they let Epstein go, but it was only because he turned state's evidence and gave the government valuable information that it needed in order to prosecute these horrible financial crimes. And Lord knows, I mean, what's more serious than financial crimes, right? I mean, abuse, and we're using the term abuse because we don't want to get into a lot of the details, but it's real serious. It's really, really serious and nasty and sad, the things that were done to these poor girls. And it was a pattern in practice. I mean, he got these girls recruiting other girls, and he was paying them a finder's fee to essentially bring their friends over, etc.
They called them female fixers.
Yeah, female fixers. And, of course, Epstein's...
Fixer-uppers.
Yeah, I know. Epstein's number one fixer is a lady named Ghislaine Maxwell. She's a British lady. She's much older. I mean, not older than Epstein, but much older than the girls that he's been after. And she was involved in recruiting a lot of girls, including a girl named Virginia Roberts, whose name is public. In fact, she's had a suit against Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and others. And she's now married, Virginia Roberts. Very sad story because she was really... she alleges, and I think has the evidence to prove it, that she was flown around the world and essentially passed around to high-level dignitaries, including Prince Andrew. The brother of Prince Charles, the younger brother and former husband of, what was his wife's name? Fergie.
Was that Princess Ferguson?
Yeah, right.
Or Duchess Ferguson, right?
Yes, that's right. And so that's her ex-husband is Prince Andrew, who got, I think, thrown out to the curb because he was such a Lothario. Well, Virginia Roberts has got a picture of her as like a 17, 16-year-old girl with Prince Andrew, with his arm around her and her arm around him. And you're going, well, geez, what's the chances of that happening to a 16, 17-year-old? And so Ghislaine Maxwell was part of the recruitment process for all this. And the Lolita plane is what's used. Yeah, there you go. You found the photo right there. So with a simple search, you can go out and find this photo for yourself. I mean, what's being told about this guy is the truth. And now finally, the FBI and NYPD Crimes Against Children Task Force has arrested him in New York. And as of this time, he has not been granted bail.
They said he's probably not going to get it.
He probably shouldn't get it because you got to worry about him getting on that plane and getting to his little island, Little St. James Island, also known as Lolita Island. And, we don't want... He's a clear flight risk. But hopefully the chickens are finally coming home to roost for Jeffrey Epstein, who's engaged in this kind of behavior for decades. And sure would be nice to see him get into trouble and see some justice done, and certainly for all the victims. We'll be right back, and we'll go out there. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. You know, when we finished up the last segment, we were talking about Jeffrey Epstein case, and there are so many details on this case, and we probably could dedicate a whole show to it. But Roxanne, you pointed out one that we didn't quite get to that really is worth mentioning.
Part of the interesting story that we want to tell you about is that President Trump was actually interviewed by the prosecution of the original Jeffrey Epstein case back in the early 2000s. And so the prosecutor had sent out a lot of requests for information, subpoenas. Right. Yeah. And got very little back, especially from all these high-powered businessmen who were hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein. But the one person who did get back to him was Trump. And again, this is early 2000s. And he said he just called him and said, let me know. Let's talk about this. Anything you want to hear from me to help you, I've got information. And some of that information led to helping in that case.
Yeah. Apparently, yeah, he provided helpful information, and he was the only one that did so. So I know I've seen some connections, and Trump said some things about Epstein, about him liking beautiful young women, even younger than what Trump likes. And people have kind of tied the two of them or tried to tie the two of them together. But if you really dive into this subject matter, I mean, this is something that Fusion GPS and Glenn Simpson actually looked into, and they funded an investigation of. And at the end of the day, they were never able to tie President Trump to Jeffrey Epstein by anything more than just regular New York socializing. So when he was called upon to provide evidence of what he knew about, he apparently is the only one of these New York socialites who did so, and did so voluntarily, and provided helpful evidence. And now we want to switch and go out there, but before we do that, we had a caller call in, and they mentioned, hey, we'd love to have an out there on this topic. So we'll tell you a little bit about that, and that is the great whirl that's off the coast. Whirl, W-H-I-R-L, not world, but whirl, that's off the coast of Somalia. That's a giant whirlpool that is larger than the state of Colorado. So it's this giant whirlpool. I mean, you don't want to get stuck in that one. You know what I'm saying?
And the currents go down a mile deep.
Holy moly. So it actually pulls. You mean the currents go down into the ocean a mile deep?
Right.
Wow.
And the reason why it's bringing it all back up now, it's larger than they ever thought. They knew it was out there, but it's much bigger now. Whether it's getting bigger or stronger, who knows? And I think probably because the earthquakes, all of this could be tied in somehow. What do you think?
Did somebody pull the plug out of the earth down there on the bottom of the ocean?
There's a hole down there somewhere that's getting bigger.
Yeah, this has been around, it looks like, since at least the 1860s. They first discovered it. So what we promised to do is we promised to look into this and bring you a little more information about that, because that was not our Out There segment for today.
But good idea.
It is a great idea, and we appreciate the call and cluing us into that. But we did want to cover something that has happened over the past couple of months that has not been reported on, and that is a series of massive volcanic eruptions that have been occurring primarily along the Ring of Fire. And what this brings to mind is previously when we've had a lot of volcanic eruptions, or maybe even one really big volcanic eruption in the world, and an ejection of ash up into the stratosphere, what that's resulted in is massive global cooling. In fact, in the year 1816, it's called the year without a summer. They didn't even have a summer because they had some of these volcanic eruptions, and the sun was basically blocked by the ash. They had cooler temperatures, and they were even having snow in tropical areas. So imagine snow in Key West, for example, getting down, because, we're although we are a very hot area, we're semi-tropical. I mean, we're somewhat temperate still here in Tampa Bay. But if you really get down into the tropical areas along the equator and stuff, I mean, imagine if it was cold enough to snow, say, down in Costa Rica or Panama or something like that. I mean, that would just be so unbelievable. Well, guess what? Just a few weeks ago, you probably saw the story in Guadalajara, Mexico. They had a hailstorm. It was almost biblical in nature because so much hail fell that it was piled up 6 feet high in Guadalajara, Mexico.
Does that have anything to do with the flip-flopping of the poles that you talked about on previous Out
Theirs? I don't know. This could all be related. I mean, we could make a lot of speculations about what's causing this, but the truth is we don't understand enough about our planet to say for sure one way or the other. But what we can say is there have been a lot of volcanic eruptions, and this is not being reported. So I'll just run through some of the major ones. And by the way, If it ejects ash to above about 10 kilometers, and that's about 33,000 feet, then the ash basically goes on up into the stratosphere, and that's what can result in massive global cooling, particularly if there's enough ash ejected. Well, if we jump back to May 25th, the Sinabung volcano, which is one of the biggest in Indonesia, in fact, it may be the biggest, and it's on the island of Sumatra, had a massive eruption and ejected ash up to about 50,000 feet. A little more than a couple of weeks later, on June 9th, it erupted again, this time ejecting ash, a massive cloud, up to 55,000 feet. On June 3rd, a volcano just outside of Mexico City, and we're going to see if I could say this properly, Popocatépetl. I always have trouble with that one, but that's an old Aztec word. Anyway, that volcano erupted and ejected ash to about 37,000 feet. Also erupted again on June 17th, and it had 187 separate exhalations, is what they call them, or releases of ash up into the air, the largest of which went up to 42,000 feet. So all these that we're telling you about, these are ejected ash high enough to actually get up into the stratosphere, and it takes a couple of years for it to finally fall back down because of the wind patterns that keep it up there in the stratosphere. That was June 17th. Fast forward to June 21st and 22nd, Rykoki volcano in Russia actually erupted, sending ash up to 43,000 feet. June 26th, Ulawun volcano in Papua New Guinea erupted. Now, these are all, as you know, on the Ring of Fire, which basically rings the entire Pacific Ocean and is the most active volcanic area in the entire world, and is where most of the volcanoes have been going off, and most of them exist. But this one ejected on Papua New Guinea, ejected ash to about 50,000 feet. You had another one also on Papua New Guinea the very next day called Manam, and that one ejected ash also to approximately 50,000 feet. Now, they actually have a group of scientific observatory posts that measure the ejection of volcanic ash. So these numbers are actually coming from those scientific posts, and that's called the Volcanic Ash Advisory Center. And it's got locations a number of different places, including in Japan and Tokyo, and it's got one in Darwin in Papua New Guinea. So there are a number of locations throughout the Ring of Fire. But the question is, now with all this ash recently ejected up into the stratosphere, are we going to be looking at something like a year without summer coming up next year? And what does that result in? I mean, you don't get crops, you don't get food production when you don't have enough sunlight for the plants to grow, for the growth of all the things that we eat. And then what happens to the animals when they don't have anything to eat? They die off. It's kind of like, remember the story about the dinosaurs and that massive meteor that hit the Earth, or comet that hit the Earth and ejected all that ash and rock up into the stratosphere and created a cool environment? Well, we're looking at the same thing on a little bit smaller scale. But it still could have a very serious effect on human life here on our planet. So you won't hear the mainstream media report that to you. I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it.
Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.